Chapter 11 of The Promised Land. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Recording by Bridget Gage. The Promised Land by Mary Antin. Chapter 11. My Country. The public school has done its best for us foreigners and for the country when it has made us into good Americans. I am glad it is mine to tell how the miracle was wrought in one case. You should be glad to hear of it, you born Americans, for it is the story of the growth of your country, of the flocking of your brothers and sisters from the far ends of the earth to the flag you love, of the recruiting of your armies of workers, thinkers, and leaders. And you will be glad to hear of it, my comrades in adoption, for it is a rehearsal of your own experience, the thrill and wonder of which your own hearts have felt. How long would you say, wise reader, it takes to make an American? By the middle of my second year in school, I had reached the 6th grade. When, after the Christmas holidays, we began to study the life of Washington, running through a summary of the Revolution and the early days of the Republic, it seemed to me that all my reading and study had been idle until then. The reader, the arithmetic, the song book that had so fascinated me until now, became suddenly sober exercise books, tools wherewith to hew a way to the source of inspiration. When the teacher read to us out of a big book with many bookmarks in it, I sat rigid with attention in my little chair, my hands tightly clasped on the edge of my desk, and I painfully held my breath, to prevent sighs of disappointment escaping, as I saw the teacher skip the parts between bookmarks. When the class read, and it came my turn, my voice shook and the book trembled in my hands. I could not pronounce the name of George Washington without a pause. Never had I prayed, never had I chanted the songs of David, never had I called upon the Most Holy in such utter reverence and worship as I repeated the simple sentences of my child's story of the patriot. I gazed with adoration at the portraits of George and Martha Washington, till I could see them with my eyes shut. And whereas formerly my self-consciousness had bordered on conceit, and I thought myself an uncommon person, parading my schoolbooks through the streets, and swelling with pride when a teacher detained me in conversation, now I grew humble all at once, seeing how insignificant I was beside the great. As I read about the noble boy who would not tell a lie to save himself from punishment, I was for the first time truly repentant of my sins. Formerly I had fasted and prayed and made sacrifice on the days of atonement, but it was more than half play, in mimicry of my elders. I had no real horror of sin, and I knew so many ways of escaping punishment. I am sure my family, my neighbors, my teachers in Polotzk, all my world in fact, strove together by example and precept to teach me goodness. Saintliness had a new incarnation in about every third person I knew. I did respect the saints, but I could not help seeing that most of them were a little bit stupid, and that mischief was more fun than piety. Goodness, as I had known it, was respectable, but not necessarily admirable. The people I really admired, like my Uncle Solomon and Cousin Rachel, were those who preached the least and laughed the most. My sister Frieda was perfectly good, but she did not think the less of me because I played tricks. What I loved in my friends was not inimitable. One could be downright good if one really wanted to. One could be learned if one had books and teachers. One could sing funny songs and tell anecdotes if one traveled about and picked up such things, like one's uncles and cousins. But a human being strictly good, perfectly wise, and unfailingly valiant, all at the same time, I had never heard or dreamed of. This wonderful George Washington was as inimitable as he was irreproachable. Even if I had never told a lie, I could not compare myself to George Washington, for I was not brave. I was afraid to go out when snowballs whizzed, and I could never be the first president of the United States. So I was forced to revise my own estimate of myself, but the twin of my newborn humility, paradoxical as it may seem, was a sense of dignity I had never known before. For if I found that I was a person of small consequence, I discovered at the same time that I was more nobly related than I had ever supposed. I had relatives and friends who were notable people by the old standards. I had never been ashamed of my family. But this George Washington, who died long before I was born, was like a king in greatness, and he and I were fellow citizens. There was a great deal about fellow citizens in the patriotic literature we read at this time, and I knew from my father how he was a citizen, through the process of naturalization, and how I also was a citizen, by virtue of my relation to him. Undoubtedly I was a fellow citizen, and George Washington was another. It thrilled me to realize what sudden greatness had fallen on me, and at the same time it sobered me, as with a sense of responsibility. I strove to conduct myself as befitted a fellow citizen. Before books came into my life, I was given to star-gazing and daydreaming. When books were given me, I fell upon them as a glutton pounces on his meat after a period of enforced starvation. I lived with my nose in a book, and took no notice of the alternations of the sun and stars. But now, after the advent of George Washington and the American Revolution, I began to dream again. I strayed on the common after school instead of hurrying home to read. I hung on fence rails, my pet book forgotten under my arm, and gazed off to the yellow-streaked February sunset, and beyond, and beyond. I was no longer the central figure of my dreams. The dry weeds in the lane crackled beneath the tread of heroes. What more could America give a child? Ah, much more. As I read how the patriots planned the Revolution, and the women gave their sons to die in battle, and the heroes led to victory, and the rejoicing people set up the Republic, it dawned on me gradually what was meant by my country. The people all desiring noble things, and striving for them together, defying their oppressors, giving their lives for each other. All this it was that made my country. It was not a thing that I understood. I could not go home and tell Frida about it, as I told her other things I learned at school. But I knew one could say my country, and feel it, as one felt God or myself. My teachers, my schoolmates, Miss Dillingham, George Washington himself could not mean more than I when they said my country, after I had once felt it. For the country was for all the citizens, and I was a citizen. And when we stood up to sing America, I shouted the words with all my might. I was in very earnest proclaiming to the world my love for my new-found country. I love thy rocks and rills, thy woods and templed hills. Boston Harbor, Crescent Beach, Chelsea Square, all was hallowed ground to me. As the days approached when the school was to hold exercises in honor of Washington's birthday, the halls resounded at all hours with the strains of patriotic songs, and I, who was a model of the attentive pupil, more than once lost my place in the lesson as I strained to hear, through closed doors, some neighboring class rehearsing "The Star-Spangled Banner." If the doors happened to be open and the chorus broke out unveiled, "Oh, say does that star-spangled banner yet wave O'er the land of the free and the home of the brave," delicious tremors ran up and down my spine, and I was faint with suppressed enthusiasm. Where had been my country until now? What flag had I loved? What heroes had I worshipped? The very names of these things had been unknown to me. Well I knew that Polotzk was not my country. It was Goluth, exile. On many occasions in the year we prayed to God to lead us out of exile. The beautiful Passover service closed with the words, "Next year may we be in Jerusalem." On childish lips, indeed, those words were no conscious aspiration. We repeated the Hebrew syllables after our elders, but without their hope and longing. Still, not a child among us was too young to feel in his own flesh the lash of the oppressor. We knew what it was to be Jews in exile, from the spiteful treatment we suffered at the hands of the smallest urchin who crossed himself. And thence we knew that Israel had good reason to pray for deliverance. But the story of the Exodus was not history to me in the sense that the story of the American Revolution was. It was more like a glorious myth, a belief in which had the effect of cutting me off from the actual world, by linking me with the world of phantoms. Those moments of exaltation which the contemplation of the biblical past afforded us, allowing us to call ourselves the children of princes, served but to tinge with a more poignant sense of disinheritance the long humdrum stretches of our life. In very truth, we were a people without a country. Surrounded by mocking foes and detractors, it was difficult for me to realize the persons of my people's heroes, or the events in which they moved. Except in moments of abstraction from the world around me, I scarcely understood that Jerusalem was an actual spot on the earth, where once the kings of the Bible, real people, like my neighbors in Polotzk, ruled in puissant majesty. For the conditions of our civil life did not permit us to cultivate a spirit of nationalism. The freedom of worship that was grudgingly granted within the narrow limits of the Pale by no means included the right to set up openly any idea of a Hebrew state, any hero other than the Tsar. What we children picked up of our ancient political history was confused with the miraculous story of the creation, with the supernatural legends and hazy associations of Bible lore. As to our future, we Jews in Polotzk had no national expectations, only a life-worn dreamer here and there hoping to die in Palestine. If Fetchke and I sang with my father, first making sure of our audience, "Zion, Zion, holy Zion, not forever is it lost," we did not really picture to ourselves Judea restored. So it came to pass that we did not know what "my country" could mean to a man, and as we had no country, so we had no flag to love. It was by no far-fetched symbolism that the banner of the House of Romanoff became the emblem of our latter-day bondage in our eyes. Even a child would know how to hate the flag that we were forced, on pain of severe penalties, to hoist above our housetops in celebration of the advent of one of our oppressors. And as it was with country and flag, so it was with heroes of war. We hated the uniform of the soldier to the last brass button. On the person of a Gentile, it was the symbol of tyranny. On the person of a Jew, it was the emblem of shame. So a little Jewish girl in Polotzk was apt to grow up hungry-minded and empty-hearted, and if, still in her outreaching youth, she was set down in a land of outspoken patriotism, she was likely to love her new country with a great love, and to embrace its heroes in a great worship. Naturalization, with us Russian Jews, may mean more than the adoption of the immigrant by America. It may mean the adoption of America by the immigrant. On the day of the Washington celebration, I recited a poem that I had composed in my enthusiasm. But composed is not the word. The process of putting on paper the sentiments that seethed in my soul was really very discomposing. I dug the words out of my heart, squeezed the rhythms out of my brain, forced the missing syllables out of their hiding places in the dictionary. May I never again know such travail of the spirit as I endured during the fevered days when I was engaged on the poem. It was not as if I wanted to say that snow was white or grass was green. I could do that without a dictionary. It was a question now of the loftiest sentiments, of the most abstract myths, the names of which were very new in my vocabulary. It was necessary to use polysyllables, and plenty of them, and where to find rhymes for such words as tyranny, freedom, and justice, when you had less than 2 years' acquaintance with English? The name I wished to celebrate was the most difficult of all. Nothing but Washington rhymed with Washington. It was a most ambitious undertaking, but my heart could find no rest till it had proclaimed itself to the world. So I wrestled with my difficulties and spared not ink, till inspiration perched on my pen point, and my soul gave up its best. When I had done, I was myself impressed with the length, gravity, and nobility of my poem. My father was overcome with emotion as he read it. His hands trembled as he held the paper to the light, and the mist gathered in his eyes. My teacher, Miss Dwight, was plainly astonished at my performance, and said many kind things, and asked many questions, all of which I took very solemnly, like one who had been in the clouds and returned to earth with a sign upon him. When Miss Dwight asked me to read my poem to the class on the day of celebration, I readily consented. It was not in me to refuse a chance to tell my schoolmates what I thought of George Washington. I was not a heroic figure when I stood up in front of the class to pronounce the praises of the father of his country. Thin, pale, and hollow, with a shadow of short black curls on my brow, and the staring look of prominent eyes, I must have looked more frightened than imposing. My dress added no grace to my appearance. Plaids were in fashion, and my frock was of a red and green plaid that had a ghastly effect on my complexion. I hated it when I thought of it, but on the great day I did not know I had any dress on. Heels clapped together, and hands glued to my sides, I lifted up my voice in praise of George Washington. It was not much of a voice. Like my hollow cheeks, it suggested consumption. My pronunciation was faulty, my declamation flat, but I had the courage of my convictions. I was face to face with 20 fellow citizens, in clean blouses and extra frills. I must tell them what George Washington had done for their country, for our country, for me. I can laugh now at the impossible meters, the grandiose phrases, the verbose repetitions of my poem. Years ago I must have laughed at it, when I threw my only copy into the wastebasket. The copy I am now turning over was loaned me by Miss Dwight, who faithfully preserved it all these years, for the sake, no doubt, of what I strove to express when I laboriously hitched together those dozen and more ungraceful stanzas. But to the 40 fellow citizens sitting in rows in front of me it was no laughing matter. Even the bad boys sat in attitudes of attention, hypnotized by the solemnity of my demeanor. If they got any inkling of what the hail of big words was about, it must have been through occult suggestion. I fixed their 80 eyes with my single stare, and gave it to them, stanza after stanza, with such emphasis as the lameness of the lines permitted. He whose courage, will, amazing bravery, did free his land from a despot's rule, from man's greatest evil, almost slavery, and all that's taught in tyranny's school. Who gave his land its liberty? Who was he? 'Twas he who e'er will be our pride, immortal Washington, who always did in truth confide. We hail our Washington. The best of the verses were no better than these, but the children listened. They had to. Presently I gave them news, declaring that Washington wrote the famous Constitution, sacred's the hand that this blessed guide to man had given, which says, one and all of mankind are alike, excepting none. This was received in respectful silence, possibly because the other fellow citizens were as hazy about historical facts as I at this point. Hurrah for Washington, they understood, and 3 cheers for the red, white, and blue was only to be expected on that occasion. But there ran a special note through my poem, a thought that only Israel Rubinstein or Becky Aronovitch could have fully understood besides myself. For I made myself the spokesman of the luckless sons of Abraham, saying, "Then we weary Hebrew children at last found rest in the land where reigned freedom, and like a nest. To homeless birds your land proved to us, and therefore will we gratefully sing your praise evermore." The boys and girls who had never been turned away from any door because of their father's religion sat as if fascinated in their places. But they woke up and applauded heartily when I was done, following the example of Miss Dwight, who wore the happy face which meant that one of her pupils had done well. The recitation was repeated by request before several other classes, and the applause was equally prolonged at each repetition. After the exercises I was surrounded, praised, questioned, and made much of, by teachers as well as pupils. Plainly I had not poured my praise of George Washington into deaf ears. The teachers asked me if anybody had helped me with the poem. The girls invariably asked, "Mary Antin, how could you think of all those words?" None of them thought of the dictionary. If I had been satisfied with my poem in the first place, the applause with which it was received by my teachers and schoolmates convinced me that I had produced a very fine thing indeed. So the person, whoever it was, perhaps my father, who suggested that my tribute to Washington ought to be printed, did not find me difficult to persuade. When I had achieved an absolutely perfect copy of my verses, at the expense of a dozen sheets of blue-ruled notepaper, I crossed the Mystic River to Boston and boldly invaded Newspaper Row. It never occurred to me to send my manuscript by mail. In fact, it has never been my way to send a delegate where I could go myself. Consciously or unconsciously, I have always acted on the motto of a wise man, who was one of the dearest friends that Boston kept for me until I came. "Personal presence moves the world," said the great Dr. Hale, and I went in person to beard the editor in his armchair. From the ferry slip to the offices on the Boston Transcript, the way was long, strange, and full of perils. But I kept resolutely up on Hanover Street, being familiar with that part of my route, till I came to a puzzling corner. There I stopped, utterly bewildered by the tangle of streets, the roar of traffic, the giddy swarm of pedestrians. With the precious manuscript tightly clasped, I balanced myself on the curbstone, afraid to plunge into the boiling vortex of the crossing. Every time I made a start, a clanging streetcar snatched up the way. I could not even pick out my street. The unobtrusive street signs were lost to my unpracticed sight in the glaring confusion of store signs and advertisements. If I accosted a pedestrian to ask the way, I had to speak several times before I was heard. Jews hurrying by with bearded chins on their bosoms and eyes intent shrugged their shoulders at the name "Transcript," and shrugged till they were out of sight. Italians sauntering behind their fruit carts answered my inquiry with a lift of the head that made their earrings gleam, and a wave of the hand that referred me to all 4 points of the compass at once. I was trying to catch the eye of the tall policeman who stood grandly in the middle of the crossing, a stout pillar around which the waves of traffic broke, when Deliverance bellowed in my ear, "Herald, Globe, Record, Traveler." "Eh? Whatcher want, sis?" The tall newsboy had to stoop to me. "Transcript? Sure." And in half a twinkling he had picked me out a paper from his bundle. When I explained to him, he good-naturedly tucked the paper in again, piloted me across, unravelled the end of Washington Street for me, and with much pointing out of landmarks, headed me for my destination, my nose seeking the spire of the Old South Church. I found the Transcript building a waste of corridors tunneled by a maze of staircases. On the glazed glass doors were many signs with the names or nicknames of many persons: City Editor, Beggars and Peddlers Not Allowed. The nameless world not included in these categories was warned off, forbidden to be or do. Private, no admittance. Don't knock. And the various inhospitable legends on the doors and walls were punctuated by frequent cuspidors on the floor. There was no sign anywhere of the welcome which I, as an author, expected to find in the home of a newspaper. I was descending from the top story to the street for the 7th time, trying to decide what kind of editor a patriotic poem belonged to, when an untidy boy carrying broad paper streamers and whistling shrilly, in defiance of an express prohibition on the wall, bustled through the corridor and left a door ajar. I slipped in behind him and found myself in a room full of editors. I was a little surprised at the appearance of the editors. I had imagined my editor would look like Mr. Jones, the principal of my school, whose coat was always buttoned and whose fingernails were beautiful. These people were in shirt sleeves, and they smoked, and they didn't politely turn in their revolving chairs when I came in and ask, "What can I do for you?" The room was noisy with typewriters, and nobody heard my "Please, can you tell me?" At last one of the machines stopped, and the operator thought he heard something in the pause. He looked up through his own smoke. I guess he thought he saw something, for he stared. It troubled me a little to have him stare so. I realized suddenly that the hand in which I carried my manuscript was moist, and I was afraid it would make marks on the paper. I held out the manuscript to the editor, explaining that it was a poem about George Washington, and would he please print it in the Transcript. There was something queer about that particular editor. The way he stared and smiled made me feel about 11 inches high, and my voice kept growing smaller and smaller as I neared the end of my speech. At last he spoke, laying down his pipe and sitting back at his ease. "So you have brought us a poem, my child." "It's about George Washington," I repeated impressively. "Don't you want to read it?" "I should be delighted, my dear, but the fact is—" He did not take my paper. He stood up and called across the room. "Say, Jack, here is a young lady who has brought us a poem about George Washington. Wrote it yourself, my dear?" "Wrote it all herself. What shall we do with her?" Mr. Jack came over and another man. My editor made me repeat my business, and they all looked interested. But nobody took my paper from me. They put their hands into their pockets, and my hand kept growing clammier all the time. The three seemed to be consulting, but I could not understand what they said or why Mr. Jack laughed. A fourth man, who had been writing busily at a desk near by, broke in on the consultation. "That's enough, boys," he said. "That's enough. Take the young lady to Mr. Hurd." Mr. Hurd, it was found, was away on a vacation, and of several other editors in several offices, to whom I was referred, none proved to be the proper editor to take charge of a poem about George Washington. At last an elderly editor suggested that as Mr. Hurd would be away for some time, I would do well to give up the Transcript and try the Herald across the way. A little tired by my wanderings, and bewildered by the complexity of the editorial system, but still confident about my mission, I picked my way across Washington Street and found the Herald offices. Here I had instant good luck. The first editor I addressed took my paper and invited me to a seat. He read my poem much more quickly than I could myself, and said it was very nice, and asked me some questions, and made notes on a slip of paper which he pinned to my manuscript. He said he would have my piece printed very soon, and would send me a copy of the issue in which it appeared. As I was going, I could not help giving the editor my hand, although I had not experienced any handshaking in Newspaper Row. I felt that as author and editor we were on a very pleasant footing, and I gave him my hand in token of comradeship. I had regained my full stature and something over during this cordial interview, and when I stepped out into the street and saw the crowd intently studying the bulletin board, I swelled out of all proportion, for I told myself that I, Mary Antin, was one of the inspired brotherhood who'd made newspapers so interesting. I did not know whether my poem would be put upon the bulletin board, but at any rate it would be in the paper, with my name at the bottom, like my story about snow in Miss Dillingham's school journal. And all these people in the streets, and more, thousands of people, All Boston would read my poem and learn my name, and wonder who I was. I smiled to myself in delicious amusement when a man deliberately put me out of his path, as I dreamed my way through the jostling crowd. If only he knew whom he was treating so unceremoniously. When the paper with my poem in it arrived, the whole house pounced upon it at once. I was surprised to find that my verses were not all over the front page. The poem was a little hard to find, if anything, being tucked away in the middle of the voluminous sheet. But when we found it, it looked wonderful, just like real poetry, not at all as if somebody we knew had written it. It occupied a gratifying amount of space, and was introduced by a flattering biographical sketch of the author. The material for which the friendly editor had artfully drawn from me during that happy interview. And my name, as I had prophesied, was at the bottom. When the excitement in the house had subsided, my father took all the change out of the cash drawer, and went to buy up the Herald. He did not count the pennies. He just bought Heralds, all he could lay his hands on, and distributed them gratis to all our friends, relatives, and acquaintances, to all who could read, and to some who could not. For weeks he carried a clipping from the Herald in his breast pocket, and few were the occasions when he did not manage to introduce it into the conversation. He treasured that clipping as for years he had treasured the letters I wrote him from Polotzk. Although my father bought up most of the issue containing my poem, a few hundred copies were left to circulate among the general public, enough to spread the flame of my patriotic ardor and to enkindle 1,000 sluggish hearts. Really, there was something more solemn than vanity in my satisfaction. Pleased as I was with my notoriety, and nobody but I knew how exceedingly pleased, I had a sober feeling about it all. I enjoyed being praised and admired and envied. But what gave a divine flavor to my happiness was the idea that I had publicly borne testimony to the goodness of my exalted hero, to the greatness of my adopted country. I did not discount the homage of Arlington Street, because I did not properly rate the intelligence of its population. I took the admiration of my schoolmates without a grain of salt. It was just so much honey to me. I could not know that what made me great in the eyes of my neighbors was that there was a piece about me in the paper. It mattered very little to them what the piece was about. I thought they really admired my sentiments. On the street, in the schoolyard, I was pointed out. The people said, "That's Mary Antin. She had her name in the paper." I thought they said, "This is she who loves her country and worships George Washington." To repeat, I was well aware that I was something of a celebrity, and took all possible satisfaction in the fact. Yet I gave my schoolmates no occasion to call me stuck up. My vanity did not express itself in strutting or wagging the head. I played tag and puss in the corner in the schoolyard, and did everything that was comrade-like. But in the schoolroom I conducted myself gravely, as befitting one who is preparing for the noble career of a poet. I am forgetting Lizzie McD. I am trying to give the impression that I behaved with at least outward modesty during my schoolgirl triumphs, whereas Lizzie could testify that she knew Mary Antin as a vain, boastful, curly-headed little Jew. For I had a special style of deportment with Lizzie. If there was any girl in the school besides me who could keep near the top of the class all the year through, and give bright answers when the principal or the school committee popped sudden questions, and write rhymes that almost always rhymed, I was determined that the ambitious person should not soar unduly in her own estimation. So I took care to show Lizzie all my poetry, and when she showed me hers, I did not admire it too warmly. Lizzie, as I have already said, was in a Sunday school mood even on weekdays. Her verses all had morals. My poems were about the crystal snow, and the ocean blue, and sweet spring, and fleecy clouds. When I tried to drag in a moral, it kicked so that the music of my lines went out in a groan. So I had a sweet revenge when Lizzie one day volunteered to bolster up the eloquence of Mr. Jones, the principal, who was lecturing the class for bad behavior, by comparing the bad boys in the schoolroom to the rotten apple that spoils the barrelful. The groans, coughs, ahems, feet shufflings, and paper pellets that filled the room as St. Elizabeth sat down, even in the principal's presence, were sweet balm to my smart of envy. I didn't care if I didn't know how to moralize. When my teacher had visitors, I was aware that I was the show pupil of the class. I was always made to recite, my compositions were passed around, and often I was called up on the platform, oh, climax of exaltation, to be interviewed by the distinguished strangers, while the class took advantage of the teacher's distraction, to hold forbidden intercourse on matters not prescribed in the curriculum. When I returned to my seat, after such public audience with the great, I looked to see if Lizzie McD. was taking notice. And Lizzie, who was a generous soul, her Sunday school airs notwithstanding, generally smiled, and I forgave her her rhymes. Not but what I paid a price for my honors. With all my self-possession, I had a certain capacity for shyness. Even when I arose to recite before the customary audience of my class, I suffered from incipient stage fright, and my voice trembled over the first few words. When visitors were in the room, I was even more troubled. And when I was made the special object of their attention, my triumph was marred by acute distress. If I was called up to speak to the visitors, 40 pairs of eyes pricked me in the back as I went. I stumbled in the aisle and knocked down things that were not in my way at all. And my awkwardness increasing my embarrassment, I would gladly have changed place with Lizzie or the bad boy in the back row, anything, only to be less conspicuous. When I found myself shaking hands with an august school committee man or a teacher from New York, the remnants of my self-possession vanished in awe, and it was in a very husky voice that I repeated, as I was asked, my name, lineage, and personal history. On the whole, I do not think that the school committee man found a very forward creature in the solemn-faced little girl with the tight curls and the terrible red and green plaid. These awful audiences did not always end with the handshaking. Sometimes the great personages asked me to write to them, and exchanged addresses with me. Some of these correspondences continued through the years, and were the source of much pleasure, on one side at least. And Arlington Street took notice when I received letters with important-looking or aristocratic-looking letterheads. Lizzie McD. also took notice. I saw to that. End of chapter 11.